Okay, guys, we are going to take some notes today on the Enlightenment. So, we're going to shift our focus in world history back to Europe. We've been talking about the gunpowder empires. We've been talking about, the age of exploration a little bit all over the world. We're going to now focus in on Europe. So, as an overview, I'd like to start with the 5 basic questions: who, what, where, when, and why. So, the what, well, the Enlightenment, and the word enlightenment means to enlighten, to shed light on, or to bring into the light. And it's an intellectual and philosophical movement, right? So that's the what. What is it? It's a movement surrounding a new way of thinking. Now, it happens in Europe. We're going to focus specifically on France and on England, and it happens in the 18th century. Remember, 18th century, 1700s. So in the 1700s in Europe, people, very smart people, very intellectual people, are going to have a new way of thinking about the world. They're going to develop new philosophies and new ways of thinking. Sometimes historians refer to the Age of Enlightenment as the Age of Reason because intellectuals are going to use reason to help them explain human nature and help them explain politics or philosophies, or whatever it is these new topics are. And these intellectuals, and sometimes I, from now on, will really refer to them as philosophers or enlightened thinkers. These enlightened thinkers are going to begin to think about new ideas surrounding government and philosophy, even sometimes art. We're going to talk about religion, but there's not going to be a focus on religion. But they're going to talk about government, philosophy, law, politics, human nature. They're going to think about the world in a very different way. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, this Age of Reason, or the Age of Enlightenment, they're going to use logic and science and reason to help them explain human nature. Now, I just mentioned religion. The reason we're going to focus on religion is because we're getting away from it. We are leaving tradition and leaving historical customs and moving to more logic-based reasoning. And you'll see, and I'll talk about in a second, in the causes why the scientific revolution is involved. So this is an overview. Remember, the who, intellectuals, the what, this movement, the where in Europe in the 18th century. And now we'll talk about the why. So as causes, the first is, if we focus back on what we've talked about, the Renaissance, the Reformation, the scientific revolution, these are all units or historical themes that we've focused on already. Now, we see the emerging of these values that we talked about during the Renaissance, ideas like humanism and secularism and skepticism. We also see progress when it comes to science from the scientific revolution, new ways of thinking about the world, new biologies and chemistries, and new ways of thinking about math and science as a whole. Right? The Reformation is similar as well, that idea of skepticism, but again, we're going to focus on science and in logic and reason. So that's a result. We're continuing that theme throughout the Enlightenment. And again, scientific revolution, that's 1700s as well. So similar time period. People as a whole, societies, they are tired of living under strict monarchies. All right, monarchies have dominated Europe for 1,000 years, since the Middle Ages. And people are kind of tired of it. So we see Enlightenment as a direct result of the age of absolutism. Remember, absolute power, absolutism. And people don't want monarchs to have absolute power. They're tired of it. Specifically, monarchs or kings or queens in European history, they are going to rely on the church and divine right for power. And people start questioning skepticism, remember, they start questioning whether or not monarchs really have divinity. Really, are they really put in place by God? Is that what God wants? So they start questioning religion a little bit. They start questioning politics. They start questioning government. And then lastly, as a whole, these enlightened thinkers or these philosophers, again, they're going to start to say that, no, government is not based on divine right. Government's not based on the church. We should have separation of church. We should have liberty. We should be tolerant of other religions. We should focus on progress and they're really going to think about new ways on how to govern. But the idea is, hey, let's get away from monarchies. This has been too long, right? These people have the aristocrats, the wealthy, the kings and rulers, the royal families have too much power, right? We want to give power back to the people. So those are some of the causes as a whole. Again, it's a melting pot of different causes and reasons. There's not one specific reason, but it's laying the foundation across Europe for these changes to occur. So if we focus on specifics, now I'm going to focus on some of the enlightened thinkers themselves. We're going to talk about a few of them now. We'll go into some videos. We'll do some primary source readings. We'll do some secondary source readings. But I want to focus on a few of them. And you have a chart. I will share a chart with you that you can kind of fill out some of these information. Some of this information. So Thomas Hobbes is the first enlightened thinker. And he's actually kind of the outlier with the rest of them. So I always start with Hobbes because he's an early philosopher. And he's from England. His most famous work is called The Leviathan. He wrote in 1651. So this is early Enlightenment, early 17th century. So a little bit prior to the 18th century, but still important. And Thomas Hobbes, you may have heard of him before. Hobbes actually believes that monarchies should rule. And he believes that monarchies should rule and single rulers are best because society is constantly at what he calls a state of nature. And this state of nature is constantly bickering. They're constantly fighting. And that makes sense. If we look back at European history through the 1500s, the 1600s, into the 1700s, war is a major theme. And Hobbes thinks single ruler is best for society. He also believes in something called the social contract. And I'll talk a lot about this with a few other enlightened thinkers in a couple minutes. But he says that society has what's called an unwritten social contract. And this contract, which is signed, between two people or two parties, in this case, the people and the ruler. And again, it's not a actual physical contract, but a more of an idea. And he thinks that this contract should aim to give one person the power, and the person in power exists to keep the people protected, right? And the people should exist, to be loyal to that ruler. So that's his idea of the social contract. And with this, this state of nature, people want to get rid of. They want to escape this warfare, escape the turmoil of the state of nature. And he says, you give up your liberty, you give up your individual freedom in order to be safe in this state of nature. All right, so a lot of really new ideas, and some old as well, but that's the first enlightened thinker, Thomas Hobbes. War is, people are constantly at the state of nature at war, and a single ruler is best to be strict, to create laws in order to keep people in check, which, you have to agree with him. People are, warfare is a common theme. So maybe this is a good way to think about government and think about politics. So that's the first one, and you'll notice from here on out, the next few enlightened thinkers are going to have very different views about the world. Our next enlightened thinker and philosopher is John Locke. Probably the most famous. We always compare John Locke and Thomas Hobbes because they basically are opposites. But John Locke is an English philosopher as well. A little bit later, if we look at the dates, 1588, John Locke's born in 1632. So a little bit later, they lived around the same time. And he wrote his most famous work of literature is called Two Treatises of Government from 1689. And Locke has some, very different beliefs. He says that, number one, political authority is not derived from religious authority. So right away, he calls out divine right. It's not about what God thinks and who God should be in power. It's about how people can put people in power. He says it shouldn't be about divinity. It shouldn't be about God. It shouldn't be about the Pope. It shouldn't be about religion. He also agrees in an unwritten social contract, but he says that people should keep some rights. They shouldn't give up all their rights. And he quotes three in his work of literature, Two Treatises of Government. He quotes three things: life, liberty, and property. And he thinks all men should have those rights. Now, a ruler who violates the rights of life, liberty, and property, they're breaking that idea of a social contract. And that's when a ruler should change. He also, on a kind of a side note of human nature, John Locke believes that people are born with a blank slate and their experiences are what molds them. We'll talk about this a little bit in more detail, but that's a different idea of or a new, you may have heard the term nature versus nurture. This is kind of where that idea comes to mind. So that's John Locke. Life, liberty, and property are the most important things that Locke brings to the table. And that will influence some future governments, which we'll get to eventually. All right, our next ruler is Baron de Montesquieu. Montesquieu is how you say his last name. I usually will just drop his first name and call him Montesquieu. Montesquieu is French, right? Around the same time, a little bit later, we're kind of going in chronological order here. Montesquieu wrote The Spirit of Laws in 1748. And his main belief, and one that you're probably very familiar with, is dividing government into branches, specifically three. And I always tell students this mnemonic device: Montesquieu, 3 syllables, 3 branches of government. And this is actually a quote written from The Spirit of Laws. It says, "In every government there are 3 sorts of power: the legislative, the executive, in respect to things dependent on laws of nations, and the executive in regard to matters that depend on civil." So today we have 3 different branches, but this is where we get our 3 branches of law from Baron de Montesquieu, from the Enlightenment. So we see modern day connections. And this way, because of this, government's going to have those checks and balances, which is, a reason for government to exist. So one doesn't get too powerful. Voltaire. All right, I'm going to take a pause here. We're going to stop at Montesquieu, and we will continue with Voltaire a little bit more later.